The surveyor's report landed on the table between them like a loaded gun, and Lavinia Callahan's green eyes never once left Cyrus Covington's face as it did. She had ridden 3 days across sun-baked Nevada territory to reach the Covington ranch, and in all that time she had rehearsed exactly what she would say when she finally stood before the man who had stolen her family's land. She had prepared herself for denial. She had prepared herself for fury, for bluster, for the kind of theatrical outrage that powerful men in 1882 reached for the way other men reached for whiskey. What she had not prepared herself for was the way his jaw tightened, the way his dark eyes dropped to the document and then rose again to her face, and the way absolute silence fell over him like a man receiving news he had been dreading for years. He already knew. That was the thing that stopped her prepared speech cold in her throat. He already knew, and the knowing sat on him like a stone, and when his gaze met hers, it did not carry the hard shine of a guilty man caught in a lie. It carried something far more complicated than guilt. It carried the look of a man who had been waiting, with something that bordered on relief, to finally be found. "Mr. Covington," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, steady as the hand she kept flat on top of that document. "This report places the true boundary of Callahan land approximately 400 yards east of where your fence currently stands, which means that the section you have been grazing, the section my father was told had been legally transferred in the Territorial Act of 1878, never legally transferred at all. The signature on that deed is a forgery." She watched his throat move. "I already know," he said. Those 3 words detonated inside her chest like dynamite in a mine shaft, and for a moment the high Nevada sun blazing through the ranch house window, the dust motes spinning in the air between them, the distant sound of cattle lowing beyond the ridge, all of it contracted to the single point of his face. She had come here with righteous fury burning in her chest like a coal, and he had just doused it with 3 words and replaced it with something far more dangerous, because he had confirmed it. He had sat across from her in his own house, in the house that sat on land that was partly hers, and he had confirmed what the surveyor's report said without deflection, without the practiced innocence of a man with money enough to hire lawyers. He had said those 3 words and meant all of them, and now Lavinia Callahan found herself in a situation she had absolutely not prepared for. She had prepared to fight him. She had not prepared to understand him. It had begun, as most disasters do, with a letter. Lavinia Callahan had been living in San Francisco in the spring of 1882, working as a draftsman's assistant in a cartography firm on Clay Street, which was the precise kind of occupation that respectable women were not supposed to hold, and which she had obtained by signing her initial L. Callahan on her application, and letting the firm's owner assume for 3 weeks that she was a man named Lawrence. By the time he discovered his mistake, she had already proven herself indispensable, and James Phelan, who had been in the business of making maps of new American territory since the railroad companies began their expansion, was a practical enough man to keep her on despite the scandal it caused his other employees. It was that job which had given her the tools to understand what she was looking at when the letter arrived from her younger brother Patrick in late April of that year. Patrick was 22 and had been managing what remained of their father's Nevada land grant since their father Declan Callahan's death from fever 2 years prior. The Callahan land grant encompassed 1,200 acres of high desert scrubland northeast of the town of Elko, and while it was not the kind of land that made men rich, it had been enough to run modest cattle operations and sustain the family's claim to territory that Declan had fought hard to establish in the early days of Nevada statehood. But Patrick's letter described a situation that had been deteriorating for over a year, a situation involving a neighboring rancher named Cyrus Covington, who had expanded his fence line steadily eastward until nearly 400 acres of Callahan grazing land lay enclosed inside Covington territory. Patrick had gone to the county land office in Elko and been shown a transfer document bearing their father's signature, transferring the disputed section to one Harlan Covington, Cyrus's late father, in 1878 under the terms of a territorial resettlement act that Patrick had never heard their father mention. The county clerk had been sympathetic but firm. The document was on record. Without evidence that it was fraudulent, there was nothing to be done. Lavinia had read that letter 3 times, and then she had done what Patrick had not thought to do. She had gone to work. She spent 6 weeks pulling every available survey record, every territorial map, every land office filing that bore any relation to Lander County, Nevada. She cross-referenced the boundary descriptions in her family's original grant with every subsequent filing from the surrounding parcels. She compared handwriting samples, she traced the surveyor's methodology, and she found, buried in the Nevada Territorial Survey Archive on Pacific Street, a discrepancy so fundamental that it made her hands shake when she found it. The 1878 transfer document described the transferred section using boundary markers that did not exist in any survey conducted prior to 1880. Whoever had written that document had made a critical amateur error. They had used a reference point, a rock formation called Setter's Bluff, as a boundary anchor, but Setter's Bluff did not appear by that name in any survey or land record until 1880, when a federal surveying team led by one Obadiah Green had mapped the region and named it. In 1878, the section of the 1878 transfer document had simply not been knowable using the language employed in the document. The document was a forgery. It had been written after 1880 and backdated to 1878. She had retained a surveyor named Marcus Webb, a methodical and scrupulously honest man who had worked for the Federal Land Office for 11 years before going private, and she had sent him to Lander County with instructions to conduct a full boundary survey of the Callahan grant using the original 1871 documentation. His report, the same report now lying under her hand on Cyrus Covington's table, confirmed everything she had suspected. The true boundary of Callahan land ran 412 yards east of where the Covington fence currently stood. Then she had packed a single trunk, purchased a train ticket on the Central Pacific Railroad, and ridden east toward Nevada with the report in her satchel and 4 years of accumulated rage burning quietly behind her eyes. She had not expected him to be 34 years old and sitting behind a plain pine desk in a ranch house that was notably, almost pointedly, less grand than she had imagined for a man of his property and reputation. She had not expected him to be the kind of man who had dark eyes that moved across Marcus Webb's survey report with the careful attention of someone who genuinely understood what he was reading. And she had absolutely not expected him to say, "I already know." "Then explain," she said, in that same careful, steady voice. "Explain how you know, and explain why you are still in possession of land you know was stolen from my family." Cyrus Covington rose from his chair, which brought him to his full height of 6 feet and 2 inches, and he moved to the window of the ranch house and stood looking out at the scrubland and the distant ridge of the Tuscarora Mountains with his hands clasped behind his back. He was broad-shouldered in the way of a man who had done physical labor all his life and not merely delegated it, and his face carried the particular weathering of the Nevada sun, brown and lined around the eyes, with a jaw that was set so firmly it might have been cast from the same iron as the stove behind him. "My father did it," he said. Lavinia did not move. Harlan Covington had a man named Clifford Bright in the county land office on his payroll from 1879 to 1881. Bright had access to the filing records and the official seals. "My father had been wanting that section for years. Your father wouldn't sell, so my father had the document created." He turned from the window and looked at her directly, and there was no evasion in it. "I found out 2 years ago after my father died, and I went through his private correspondence. There are letters between him and Bright that lay out the entire arrangement." Lavinia's throat tightened. "And you did nothing." "I tried," he said, and something hard moved through his voice. I went to the land office and I was told that without the original complainant, without your father or a legal representative of his estate, I could not initiate the challenge myself. Your father had died by then. I didn't know where his family was. I had a lawyer in Elko working on it, and he told me that without someone from the Callahan side coming forward, the whole thing was liable to get tied up in territorial court for years while the land sat in limbo. And in the meantime, there were 30 of my hands depending on the grazing rights of land I knew I didn't rightfully own. So instead you grazed it anyway, she said. The anger had come back now, cleaner and colder than it had been before. You used land that was stolen from my family, and you told yourself you were the wronged party because you tried. No, he said. I told myself I was a coward. That word, delivered in a flat, unwavering voice, silenced her again. I told myself every morning for 2 years that today would be the day I found a way to make it right, and every morning I found another reason why the timing wasn't right, why the process was too complicated, why I needed more legal advice. And the truth is I was afraid. I was afraid of what it meant to tear down what my father built, even the parts of it he built on other people's suffering. Because tearing that down meant looking straight at what kind of man he was, and I wasn't ready for that. The sunlight through the window had shifted slightly, moving from gold to the deeper amber of late afternoon, and somewhere outside a horse whinnied and was answered by another. And Lavinia Callahan stood very still in the middle of a ranch house that sat on stolen land and looked at a man who had just handed her his darkest admission without being asked twice. She was furious. She was absolutely furious. And beneath the fury, like a current under river ice, something else moved quietly and refused to be named. I want the land back, she said. All 412 acres. I want the fence moved. I want the county record corrected. And I want your father's letters turned over to the territorial court so that Clifford Bright can be prosecuted for fraud if he is still living. Bright died in 1881, Cyrus said. But everything else you've asked for I will do. Just like that, she said, and the skepticism in her voice was as sharp as a surveying pin. You'll hand over 400 acres of grazing land. You're not asking for what isn't yours, he said. You're asking for what is. She studied him for a long moment, mapping his face the way she had been trained to map terrain, noting every elevation and depression, every feature that indicated what lay beneath. She was 28 years old, and she had spent the last 4 years making herself into a woman who did not need to rely on anyone's charity or goodwill, and she was not about to abandon that posture simply because a man had looked at her with honest eyes. I'll need to stay in Elko while the legal matters are settled, she said. That could take weeks. There's a decent boarding house on 3rd Street run by a woman named Mrs. Clara Hatch, he said. She's honest and she doesn't ask unnecessary questions. I'll send word ahead if you'd like. I don't need your help finding a room, Lavinia said. No, he agreed quietly. I don't expect you need help with much. She picked up Marcus Webb's survey report and replaced it in her leather satchel, snapped the buckle closed and walked to the door. At the threshold she stopped. Mr. Covington, she said, without turning around. Why did you say you already knew? Most men in your position would have denied it long enough to make things difficult. There was a pause that lasted just long enough to feel intentional. Because you came in here with a surveyor's report and a look that said you already knew the answer, he said. It seemed pointless to make you wait for me to confirm what you'd already figured out. She walked out into the Nevada afternoon without responding, and the door closed quietly behind her, and Cyrus Covington stood in the middle of his ranch house for a long time before he moved. Elko, Nevada in 1882 was a town that had grown up fast along the Central Pacific Railroad line and had not entirely caught up with its own growth. Its main street, Idaho Street, carried a mix of prosperous-looking establishments and rougher frontier enterprises, saloons and general merchandise stores, and a hotel that advertised itself as the finest establishment between Reno and Salt Lake City, which was not saying a great deal. There were perhaps 1,200 people resident in the town and several thousand more scattered across the surrounding ranching country, and the combination of railroad money, cattle money, and the residue of the earlier mining booms had given it a specific quality of ambition that Lavinia recognized immediately. It was a town full of people who had come here to claim something. She found Mrs. Clara Hatch's boarding house on 3rd Street without any assistance, and found it to be exactly as described, clean and plainly furnished and presided over by a woman of 50, who had the watchful, measuring eyes of someone who had seen enough of the West to be surprised by very little of it. Mrs. Hatch gave Lavinia a room on the 2nd floor with a window that looked east toward the mountains, asked a standard week's rate in advance, and offered her a place at the supper table that evening, all without once asking what had brought her to Elko or how long she planned to stay. Lavinia was grateful for the lack of questions. She had enough of her own. She spent her first 2 days in Elko establishing the legal groundwork for what she needed. She found a lawyer named Thomas Aldrich, who had an office above the general merchandise store on 5th Street, and who had enough experience with land claims to understand immediately what the forged transfer document meant for the Covington title. He was also, crucially, the kind of man who showed no particular surprise at being retained by a woman who had done more of her own legal research than most of his male clients ever bothered to. They filed notice of the disputed boundary claim with the county land office on the 2nd day, which by territorial law required a formal response from the titled landowner within 30 days. On the 3rd day, Cyrus Covington rode into Elko alone and went directly to Thomas Aldrich's office. Lavinia was there when he arrived. She had not expected him to come so quickly. She had expected resistance, or at minimum, the kind of procedural delay that men with property could generate almost effortlessly when they chose to. Instead, he walked into Aldrich's small, paper-crowded office, removed his hat, looked at Lavinia with a directness that she was beginning to realize was characteristic of him, and placed a packet of letters on the lawyer's desk. "These are the correspondence between my father and Clifford Bright," he said. 8 letters from 1879 and 1880. I've also prepared a written statement attesting to their authenticity and the circumstances under which I obtained them. And I've spoken to my foreman, who is willing to testify that the fence in question was extended under my father's orders in 1880, after the fraudulent transfer was filed. Thomas Aldrich looked at the letters, then at Cyrus, then at Lavinia. "This is rather extraordinary," he said. "The boundary correction should be straightforward with this evidence," Cyrus said. "I'd like the process to move as quickly as possible." "Whose interest is that in exactly?" Lavinia said. Cyrus looked at her. "Yours," he said. "And honestly mine. I've been managing that section under a cloud for 2 years. I'd rather have the matter settled." She wanted to find the crack in it, the hidden motive, the angle he was working that she hadn't identified yet. She had spent 4 years in San Francisco learning to identify the hidden motives behind men's stated ones, because in her experience the stated motive was almost never the complete truth. But his face offered her nothing she could pull apart. It was frank and still and entirely unperformative. "I'll need a few days to review these," Aldrich said, shuffling through the letters. "And we'll need to coordinate with the county surveyor to formally record the corrected boundary. Miss Callahan, if Mr. Covington's documentation is as straightforward as it appears, you're looking at perhaps 3 to 4 weeks for the full legal correction." 3 to 4 weeks. Lavinia looked at the packet of letters on the desk. She looked at Cyrus Covington, standing with his hat in his hands, with the particular stillness of a man who had made up his mind about something at considerable personal cost, and was not asking for recognition for it. She thought about Patrick back on the Callahan land, managing what he could with limited resources, and about her father who had built that land claim with his own hands and had his name forged by a corrupt clerk in service to a greedy man. 3 to 4 weeks, she said. "Fine." She was almost out of the door before she registered that Cyrus Covington had fallen into step beside her on the sidewalk, matching her pace without being asked. "There's something else," he said. She slowed slightly. "Your brother Patrick," he said. "I know he's been managing the land on the other side of the fence, but there's a water rights issue that affects both properties, and once the boundary is corrected, it's going to matter which side of the line the main spring sits on." Lavinia stopped walking. She turned to look at him. "Which side does it sit on?" "The survey puts it about 40 feet inside what will be Callahan land once the boundary is corrected," he said. "Which means your family will control the primary water source for the disputed section. My cattle on the adjacent Covington land have been watering from that spring for 2 years. I'm going to need to negotiate access." She was already running the implications. A spring in this country was not a minor asset. It was the difference between viable grazing and scorched earth. Her father had known it when he'd established the grant. Harlan Covington had known it when he had arranged the forgery. The spring had been the real prize all along. "Then we'll negotiate," she said, "fairly." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the possibility of one, like a door opening an inch. "I'd expect nothing less." She walked back to the boarding house in the afternoon heat and sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her palms together and tried to organize what she was feeling into something useful and manageable. The land dispute was progressing. Patrick would have his 400 acres back. That was what she had come here for, and it was within reach. But there was the man who had said, "Because you came in here with a surveyor's report and a look that said you already knew the answer." The man who had handed over letters that condemned his own father, without being compelled to do so by law. The man who had called himself a coward in the same voice other men used to call themselves heroes. She pressed her palms together harder and thought about San Francisco and the cartography firm, and the life she had built with considerable determination. And she reminded herself that she was not the kind of woman who let herself be distracted by a man simply because he had surprised her. She was in the middle of this reminder when Mrs. Hatch knocked on her door to announce that supper was ready, and Lavinia washed her face and went downstairs and ate roast chicken and biscuits with 4 other boarders: a railroad surveyor named Hopkins, a dry goods merchant named Keel, a schoolteacher named Miss Darcy Fowler who was 25 and had come from Ohio, and said nothing to any of them about what was taking up all of the available space in her mind. The negotiations over the spring water rights began the following Monday at Thomas Aldrich's office, and were, by any reasonable measure, the most unusual business meetings Lavinia Callahan had ever conducted. Unusual not because of the subject matter, which was perfectly standard in terms of Western land law, but because of the particular quality of attention that Cyrus Covington brought to the proceedings. He had done his homework. He arrived with a handwritten summary of the spring's flow rate across different seasons, based on records his foreman had kept for the past 3 years. He had drawn a rough map of the access route his cattle used. He had prepared 3 different potential arrangements for water sharing, ranging from seasonal access rights to a more permanent easement, and he had written out the costs and benefits of each from both sides' perspectives with a clarity that surprised Aldrich openly and surprised Lavinia in a way she kept internal. "You've thought about this quite thoroughly," she said, looking at his written proposals. "I've had 2 years to think about it," he said. "Ever since I found those letters, I've known this day was coming. I figured I might as well be ready." "And yet you didn't reach out to find the Callahan family yourself," she said. It wasn't quite an accusation. It wasn't entirely not one either. He met her gaze. "I told you, I was a coward." "You keep saying that," she said, "because it keeps being true." Aldrich cleared his throat. "Perhaps we could review the 3 proposals." They spent 2 hours going through the details, and what emerged was a picture of 2 properties whose interests were more interconnected than either the fraud or the fence line had allowed them to be. The Covington cattle's water access was a legitimate concern. The spring's overflow ran east, feeding a small seasonal creek that in wet years watered a portion of Callahan grazing land. The two properties needed each other in ways that Harlan Covington's greed had obscured, because stealing land was a cruder solution than the honest arrangement that geography was always offering. By the end of the meeting, they had outlined a water access agreement that gave the Covington Ranch seasonal access to the spring between June and September, when the creek was typically dry, in exchange for a maintenance contribution to the stone channel that directed the spring's flow. It was equitable, and crucially, it was the kind of arrangement that two neighboring ranchers with goodwill between them might have arrived at in an afternoon back in 1871, without any forgery or fraud or 4 years of wrongful dispossession being necessary at all. Outside the office, on the dusty wooden sidewalk of Idaho Street with the afternoon sun pressing down on the corrugated metal rooftops across the way, Lavinia tucked the draft agreement into her satchel and said, "I want to see the spring." Cyrus looked at her. Now, if I'm going to sign an access agreement over it, I want to see the thing in person." There was a pause, and in that pause she saw him weigh something, and then he said, "It's a 2-hour ride from here. I have a horse. You'd need to ride onto Covington land to reach it." "I'm aware of that," she said evenly. He nodded once. "I'll meet you at the east edge of town in an hour." Lavinia was at the east edge of town in 45 minutes on a bay mare she had hired from the Elko livery stable, a sturdy, sensible animal that moved with the kind of steady economy she appreciated in a horse. Cyrus arrived in 50 minutes on a dark roan gelding that was clearly his own, and moved with the loose-limbed confidence of a horse that knew its work. They rode east without a great deal of conversation for the first part of the journey, because there was something about the Nevada landscape that made speech feel less necessary than it did in cities. The high desert stretched out around them in long, undulating swells of sage and bunch grass, interrupted by outcroppings of pale rock and the occasional dark mass of juniper, and overhead the sky was the particular shade of deep blue that only existed at this altitude, clear and borderless and indifferent to human anxiety. It was Cyrus who eventually broke the quiet. "You work as a cartographer," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "A draftsman's assistant," she said. "At a cartography firm in San Francisco. That's how you knew what you were looking at in the Territorial Survey Archive," he said. "That's how I knew to look there," she said. "Most people outside the profession don't know those archives exist, let alone what they contain." He was quiet for a moment, riding easily, his hat pulled down against the sun. "You've been building a case for this for a long time. 6 weeks of active research, 2 years of suspicion before that. What made you suspicious?" he asked. She considered. "My father never mentioned the transfer to any of us. Not to me, not to Patrick, not to our mother before she died. He talked about that land constantly. He talked about every boundary marker, every water source, every seasonal variance in the grass. He was the kind of man who explained things. If he had sold or transferred 400 acres, he would have explained it." She paused. "When Patrick sent me the letter and described the transfer document, my first thought was not that something was wrong. My first thought was that my father had simply not had the chance to tell us. But the longer I sat with it, the more wrong it felt. It felt wrong like a note played in the wrong key feels wrong. You might not be able to name the discord immediately, but you hear it." "That's a good way to put it," Cyrus said quietly. "How did you feel," she said, "when you read your father's letters?" The question was more personal than anything she had asked him yet, and she felt it as she asked it, the line she was crossing from adversarial negotiation into something less formally boundaried. He didn't answer immediately. He let the roan pick its way around a scatter of loose rock, and his gaze went out across the sage flats and came back. "Like the floor had gone out under me," he said. "My father was not a gentle man, but I had believed he was an honest one. I had believed that because I needed to believe it. Finding out otherwise was like finding out the ground you've been standing on your whole life was laid over a hollow." The honesty of it settled over her without warning, and she looked at the line of the mountains and breathed the dry sage air and thought about what it must have been like to read those letters, to see a man you had organized your understanding of the world around revealed as something smaller and more corrupt than you'd believed. "I'm sorry," she said. She had not meant to say it. It came out before she thought about it. He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was not quite surprise and not quite gratitude, but that lived somewhere in the territory between them. "Thank you," he said. They rode in silence after that for a while, but it was a different kind of silence, less like the absence of speech and more like the presence of something that didn't require it. The spring emerged from a low shelf of pale limestone at the base of a slight rise. A genuine, clear-running spring that moved out of the rock with the particular quiet confidence of water that had been finding its way to that exact spot for centuries. The flow was modest but consistent, gathering into a rocky basin before channeling away down the shallow slope, and around it the vegetation was noticeably different from the surrounding scrub, greener and denser, with a stand of cottonwood trees growing along the channel that caught the afternoon light and turned it gold. Lavinia dismounted and walked to the edge of the basin and crouched down and put her hand in the water. It was cold. Genuinely cold, the kind of deep aquifer cold that persisted through the Nevada summer, and the clarity of it was such that she could see every pebble on the basin floor. "It's beautiful," she said, without meaning to be overheard, and then she looked up and found Cyrus standing a few feet away, watching her, not the spring, and she felt the color rise in her face and stood up quickly. "It'll serve both properties well," he said, as though she had not just been surprised by her own feelings. "Yes," she said, "it will." She looked out along the channel and thought about the cottonwoods and the water and the two families whose land touched at this point. And she thought about the fact that none of this, not the fraud, not the 4 years of wrongful possession, not the long ride from San Francisco, none of it had had to happen. Two reasonable men with goodwill between them could have sat at this spring in 1871 and written an agreement in half an afternoon, and no one would have been cheated of anything. The tragedy of it moved through her like the cold of the spring water, clean and clear and deeply unnecessary. "My father would have liked this place," she said. "Tell me about him," Cyrus said. And she did. She didn't plan to. But she found herself standing beside that spring in the Nevada afternoon and talking about Declan Callahan, who had come to Nevada from County Clare in 1865 with $40 and a determination to build something that could not be taken from him, which was the great irony, and who had established his land claim by the simple method of working it daily for 6 years, until no one in the territory could question his right to it, who had known the name of every spring and rock formation on his 1,200 acres, who had read aloud to his children from Sir Walter Scott on Sunday evenings and played the fiddle badly and with great enthusiasm at any social gathering within riding distance, who had died of pneumonia at 53, 2 years before his daughter found the proof that someone had already stolen part of what he'd built. Cyrus listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt or redirect, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, looking at the water, and then he said, "He sounds like the kind of man this country needed more of." "He was," she said. "He was exactly that kind of man." They rode back toward Elko in the longer slant of late afternoon, and somewhere in the middle of the ride, without either of them marking the exact transition, they stopped riding as an attorney's client and a land disputes defendant and started riding as two people finding their way toward each other across the complicated terrain of the things that had happened to them both. He told her about growing up on the Covington ranch under Harlan's demanding eye, about the particular pressure of being the only son of a man who had an absolute idea of what a man ought to be, and not much patience for any deviation from it. About learning to ride and rope and manage cattle before he had learned to read, and then teaching himself to read with fierce private determination, because he had understood early that knowledge was the one thing his father could not take from him. About taking over the ranch at 32 when Harlan died, and finding those letters in the bottom of a rosewood box in his father's study, and sitting on the floor of that study for an hour before he could bring himself to stand up again. She listened to all of it with the same quality of attention she gave to surveyed data, comprehensive and without judgment, organizing what she heard into the true shape of the thing rather than the shape she had expected to find. The town lights were beginning to show against the deepening sky when they came back within sight of Elko, and the evening star had appeared above the eastern ridge, and Lavinia was aware that she had spent the better part of 5 hours in this man's company, and had not once felt the particular wariness she normally maintained around men who had something she needed. "I'll walk you to the boarding house," he said. "You don't need to," she said. "I'd like to," he said. It was a different formulation, and she recognized the difference. "All right," she said. They returned the horses to the livery stable and walked the 3 blocks to Mrs. Hatch's boarding house in the blue-violet dusk, and at the door she turned to him and found him already looking at her. "Thank you," she said, "for showing me the spring." "Thank you," he said, "for coming here, for making me do what I should have done 2 years ago." She should have said something practical then. Something about seeing him at Aldrich's office for the final review of the documents. Something that maintained the businesslike structure of their situation. Instead, what she said was, "You called yourself a coward, but it takes a particular kind of courage to hand over letters that condemn your own father without being asked." He was quiet for a moment, and the street behind them was quiet too, just the distant sound of a piano from the direction of the saloon on Idaho Street and the dry, warm air moving along the sidewalk. "I don't know what it takes," he said. "I know what it cost." She went inside without saying anything more, and the door closed, and she stood in Mrs. Hatch's lamplit front hallway for a full minute before she could make herself move toward the stairs. The next 3 weeks occupied a rhythm that Lavinia had not expected, and could not have designed deliberately. The legal proceedings moved with the purposeful slowness of territorial bureaucracy, requiring multiple filings, a formal survey inspection by the county surveyor to verify Marcus Webb's measurements, a notice period for any objecting parties, and ultimately a hearing before the county land commissioner, at which both Thomas Aldrich, representing the Callahan claim, and Cyrus Covington, presenting his own cooperative testimony, would appear. Aldrich had been frank with her. "This is the most cooperative land dispute I have encountered in 12 years of practice," he said. "Normally, these things are settled through a combination of lawyers and mutual antagonism over 18 months. You may be out of it in 3 weeks because the other party is handing you everything you need." "I'm aware," she said. "Are you also aware," he said with the careful phrasing of a man who knew it was not strictly his business but felt professional responsibility obligated him to mention it, "that Mr. Covington has been asking after your welfare at the counter every morning when he comes in to sign documents?" She looked at him steadily. "Process the filings, Mr. Aldrich." "Yes, Miss Callahan." But she was aware. She was exquisitely aware of every instance of Cyrus Covington in her days, which were becoming more frequent in ways that she could almost always justify on legal grounds and could not quite entirely. He came to Aldrich's office regularly. He encountered her on Idaho Street with a frequency that might have been coincidence and might not have been. He invited her, on Tuesday of the 2nd week, to see the formal survey inspection, and she went, standing in the morning sun watching the county surveyor work his chain in transit, while Cyrus stood beside her, and explained the surveying methodology in terms that recognized her professional knowledge of it, which was the kind of consideration she was not accustomed to receiving and found she was more susceptible to than she would have liked. On Thursday of the 2nd week, he asked her to have supper at the hotel restaurant with him, and she said yes before the careful part of her mind had time to say anything about it. The hotel dining room was the most formal establishment in Elko, which meant it had tablecloths and a printed menu, and a waiter who took their order with the serious demeanor of a man performing important work. It was not San Francisco, but there was an honesty about it that she preferred. The food was plain and good. The wine was from California and not terrible. And across the table Cyrus Covington looked at her with the same directness he always did, and the candlelight found the angles of his face and did something to the general arrangement of her reasoning that she found deeply inconvenient. They talked about everything except the land dispute. They talked about Nevada history and California railroads and the particular quality of the sky at altitude, and she found herself talking about her work with a freedom she rarely allowed herself in male company, the detailed pleasure of rendering three-dimensional terrain onto a flat surface, the intellectual challenge of representing reality accurately within a medium's constraints. He asked questions that were not polite questions but real ones, questions that built on her answers toward an understanding rather than simply filling conversational space. "Do you love it?" he asked. "The work itself?" "Yes," she said, and the simplicity of the answer surprised her. "I love it more than I expected to love anything. I went into it practically because it was available to me and I was good at it, but it turned into something I can't imagine not doing." "What would you do if you couldn't return to San Francisco?" he said. She looked at him and the question sat between them with more weight than its surface indicated. "What are you asking, Mr. Covington?" she said. He looked back at her without flinching. "I'm asking what I'm asking," he said. "I imagine you know exactly what I'm asking." She set down her wine glass. She looked at the tablecloth for a moment and then back at him. "You've known me for 2 weeks," she said. "I know," he said. "I also know that 2 weeks of genuine conversation with you has been more honest than anything I've had in years, and I think you know that too." She was quiet for a moment, turning the stem of the glass in her fingers. "I built a life in San Francisco," she said. "I built it out of nothing. I was not going to sit still and let my father's work be erased and my brother's struggle, but San Francisco is my life. My work is there. My independence is there." "I know that," he said. "I'm not asking you to give it up. I'm asking whether you've thought about what it might mean if you stayed." She looked at him for a long time. "You're asking an awful lot for a man I came here to fight." "You came here and I surrendered immediately," he said. "I think that changes the terms." Despite herself, despite every controlled and well-constructed wall she had built, something in her chest broke open and let a small, involuntary laugh out, and she saw the way his eyes lit at the sound of it, and that was the moment she understood that she was genuinely in trouble. The County Land Commission hearing was held in the 3rd week, on a Wednesday morning in a room off the courthouse that smelled of pine resin and old paper. The commissioner, a heavy-set man named Edward Prout who had held the position for 6 years, heard Aldrich's presentation of the fraudulent transfer evidence, reviewed Marcus Webb's survey report, heard Cyrus Covington's sworn statement and the letters from the rosewood box, and asked a series of methodical questions before recessing for 20 minutes. When he returned, he formally invalidated the 1878 transfer document, declared the boundary to be as established by the original 1871 grant and confirmed by the 1882 survey, and ordered the county land records corrected accordingly. He referred the forged document to the territorial attorney's office, though with Clifford Bright already dead the prospects for prosecution were limited. It was over in 2 hours. Outside the courthouse, on the wooden steps in the warm morning sun, Lavinia stood with her hands clasped in front of her and felt the particular quality of completion that came from the end of a long effort. Thomas Aldrich shook her hand and told her it had been his pleasure, and that he would send a formal copy of the commissioner's ruling to Patrick Callahan directly. He shook Cyrus Covington's hand as well, with a slightly bemused expression that suggested he was still not entirely sure what to make of a land dispute whose defendant had been more cooperative than the plaintiff's own attorney. When Aldrich had gone, it was just Lavinia and Cyrus on the courthouse steps, and the morning was clear, and the mountains were vivid on the horizon, and the street below them was already busy with the ordinary commerce of Elko. "You should be getting back to your ranch," she said. "I should," he agreed. He didn't move. "And I have a train to San Francisco in 3 days," she said. "I know." The water access agreement is filed. The boundary correction will be recorded this week. Patrick will have everything he needs. Yes, she turned to look at him directly. Cyrus, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name and they both felt it. I don't know how to do this. He turned to face her fully. You could tell me what you're thinking. I'm thinking, she said slowly, that I came here with a great deal of certainty about what I needed and almost no expectation of anything beyond it. And I'm leaving with the thing I came for and considerably less certainty about everything else. Stay another week, he said. That's not a solution to anything. It's a start, he said. It's 7 more days. And I'm not asking you to make any decision about San Francisco or your work or your life. I'm asking for 7 days in which we are not on opposite sides of a legal dispute and can simply be in each other's company and see what that amounts to. She looked at him and thought about the spring and the ride back to Elko in the evening light and the supper conversation about maps and the sky and the particular quality of work that turned into love when you weren't watching, and she thought about the way he had said the word coward and meant it as a confession rather than an excuse. 7 days, she said. 7 days, he confirmed. She wired Patrick that evening to share the news of the commissioner's ruling, and Patrick's reply wire arrived the following morning, and it said, Land restored stop thank God stop when are you coming home stop also who is Cyrus Covington that you mentioned twice stop. She did not answer the last question. The 7 days that followed were unlike any period of Lavinia Callahan's adult life up to that point, which had been organized almost entirely around work and necessity, and the particular focused energy of someone who has survived loss by converting it into motion. Cyrus took her across the ranch in the mornings, not as a tour of possessions, but as a person sharing what he knew with someone he trusted to understand it. She saw how the land worked, how the cattle moved with the seasonal grass, how the water from the spring fed the whole system downstream in ways that crossed the property lines continuously in a dozen small interactions of soil and weather. She saw the logic of the place, the ecological grammar of it, and found herself mapping it internally with the same pleasure she brought to professional cartography. He showed her the rosewood box. It was not an easy thing to do. She understood that. He brought it out one evening when they were sitting on the front porch of the ranch house, watching the sun go down behind the western ridge, and he set it on the porch railing between them and opened it, and showed her the letters still inside. The handwriting was Harlan Covington's, angular and impatient, detailing his arrangement with the matter-of-fact brevity of a man who did not feel guilt about what he was doing so much as administrative irritation at having to conduct it covertly. I've read them 50 times, Cyrus said, trying to find something in them that explains him, some context that makes it make sense. Does it help, she asked, reading them again? No, he said, but I can't quite stop. She reached out and closed the box. You're not him, she said. He looked at her. I know, he said, but some mornings it takes me a while to know it. She understood that better than she wished to. The dark past that shaped you was not always your own doing. Sometimes you inherited it, and the work was not in escaping it but in refusing to repeat it, which was a different and harder thing. On the 5th day of the 7, they rode to a part of the property he called the upper bench, a wide, flat, elevated shelf of land with a long view east across the high desert basin toward the Humboldt Mountains, and spread out a meal from the saddlebags and sat on a flat rock and ate and talked while the light moved across the valley floor below them. What would you do with this land if it were yours outright? He asked her, gesturing at the sweep of it. She thought seriously about the question. Map it, she said. Properly. There are features down there that don't appear on any county survey. I spotted 3 or 4 on the ride over. The county maps are full of errors, not the kind of errors that affect legal boundaries, but the kind that affect understanding. A proper survey of this basin would take months, and it would be genuinely beautiful work. He looked at her for a long moment. There's no cartography firm in Elko, he said. No, she said. There isn't. but there's federal survey contract work in the territory. I know the Surveyor General's office in Carson City has been looking for qualified personnel for the interior surveys. She looked at him with an expression that acknowledged exactly what he was doing. "Are you making a case?" she said. "I'm presenting available information," he said. "What you do with it is your decision." "You learned that from me," she said. "I learned a great deal from you," he said. "In 3 weeks." She looked out at the valley and the mountains and the enormous, clear, indifferent sky, and she thought about San Francisco and the drafting tables and the Clay Street firm and the particular lonely freedom of a life built entirely on her own terms. And she thought about this, the upper bench and the long view and the man sitting beside her who had handed over his father's betrayal without being asked and called himself a coward and meant it as the truest thing he could say. "Cyrus," she said. "Lavinia," he answered, quiet. "I need you to know that if I stay, I'm not staying because you want me to. I'm staying because I decide to. It is not the same thing." "I know," he said. "I would not want it to be the same thing." She was quiet for another moment, watching a hawk ride the thermals over the valley floor far below, circling in the long, effortless sweep that required nothing from it but the willingness to stay in the air. "I'll write to James Phelan in San Francisco," she said. "And I'll write to the Surveyor General's office in Carson City." He said nothing. She could feel from the corner of her eye the particular quality of his stillness, the way he held everything in when something mattered. "That is not a promise," she said. "It is a reconnaissance." "Of course," he said. She turned to look at him and found him already looking at her, and the hawk was still circling and the light was still long and gold, and she leaned forward and kissed him once briefly, cleanly on the side of his jaw, and then straightened and looked back at the valley as though she had not done it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That was reconnaissance too, I assume." "Absolutely," she said, and something that had been wound extremely tight in her chest for approximately 2.5 weeks released itself all at once. She stayed longer than 7 more days. She stayed long enough to write to James Phelan and receive his reply, which arrived 2 weeks later, and which conveyed that he was sorry to lose her, genuinely, but that he would provide the strongest possible letter of recommendation if she was pursuing federal survey work, and that her drafting work on the Nevada territorial maps had always been the finest in the firm. She stayed long enough to write to the Surveyor General's office in Carson City and receive an expression of keen interest in return, and to understand that there was, in fact, meaningful and skilled work available to her in this territory if she chose to pursue it. She stayed long enough to ride to the Callahan land with Cyrus and meet Patrick, who was 22 and broad-shouldered like their father, and who looked at Cyrus Covington with the measuring wariness of a younger brother, meeting a man his sister had said almost nothing significant about in 3 weeks of correspondence, and then looked at Lavinia, and then looked back at Cyrus, and said with the directness of someone raised in the same tradition as his sister, "You're the one who handed over your father's letters." "Yes," Cyrus said. Patrick was quiet for a moment, then he put his hand out. "Then we're fine," he said. The water access agreement was reviewed and signed at the property line with both brothers present and Cyrus, and Lavinia watched the two of them walk the corrected fence line together in the afternoon sun, gesturing at landmarks, the new boundary stakes just set by the county surveyor still white and raw against the sage, and felt something of her father's presence in the land and the sun and the deliberate, honest conversation of these two men who were neighbors now in a way that the land had always intended them to be. She wrote to Mrs. Hatch and extended her stay at the boarding house. She wrote to the Surveyor General's office and accepted a preliminary assessment contract for 3 months of territory survey work in the Humboldt Basin. She found it difficult to locate an argument against any of it that held water. She also found, in the quiet of her own thinking, that the thing she had been most afraid of in considering staying was the loss of the self she had built with such deliberate effort. The independent, capable, unsentimental woman who did not need anyone's patronage or permission. And what she was slowly understanding, in the mornings riding across the high desert and the evenings on the ranch house porch, and the long conversations that had continued past every natural stopping point for weeks, was that Cyrus Covington had never once suggested she needed to become anyone different. He had treated the person she already was as exactly sufficient. He had argued with her when she was wrong and deferred to her when she was right, and asked her opinion on things outside the narrow corridor of what he supposed women knew about, and none of it felt like performance. It felt like he had simply been paying attention to who she was. That was, she eventually admitted to herself one morning in late August while watching the sun come over the eastern ridge from the window of Mrs. Hatch's boarding house, the most frightening and the most compelling thing about him. Not his honesty, though that was remarkable. Not his willingness to correct his father's wrong, though that had taken real courage regardless of what he called it. It was the attention. The thoroughgoing, unsentimental, unself-serving attention he paid to her as a specific person with a specific mind. She went to the ranch that morning and found him in the barn checking over a section of fence hardware with his foreman, a weathered man named Pete Grundy who had been on the Covington ranch for 16 years. She waited until Grundy had gone to the far end of the barn and then she said, "I've accepted the Surveyor General's assessment contract." Cyrus looked up from the fence hardware. "Good," he said. "I'll be in the field for most of the next 3 months," she said. "In the Humboldt Basin." "It's some distance from here." "I know where the Humboldt Basin is," he said. "I'll come back," she said. "That is not a reconnoiter, that is a statement of fact." He set down the fence hardware and straightened up to his full height and looked at her for a long moment, and then he crossed the barn to her and stood close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, and said in a quiet voice so that Pete Grundy could not hear, "Lavinia, I have been in love with you since the moment you walked into my ranch house with a surveyor's report and told me what I already knew. Everything since then has been me trying to be worthy of that." She felt the full weight of that sentence arrive in her chest and rearrange several things permanently. "You've been doing quite well," she said. He put his hand up and touched her face, careful and certain at the same time, the way he did everything, and she leaned into it the smallest degree. And the barn smelled of horses and dry wood, and the Nevada morning was bright and clean through the open doors. And Pete Grundy made a sound at the far end of the barn that very clearly indicated he was looking in the opposite direction. She was in the field for 11 weeks, working the Humboldt Basin survey with an assistant the Surveyor General's office provided, a young man named Eli Marsh who was 23 in earnest, and who absorbed her professional instruction with the gratifying intensity of someone who understood he was learning from a better practitioner than most. They covered 200 square miles of basin terrain and produced survey documents of a detail and accuracy that the Surveyor General, upon review, described as the best field survey his office had received since the original 1866 territorial survey. She wrote to Cyrus from the field camps, letters that began formally and became less formal over the weeks, letters that described the terrain and the work and the quality of the light in the basin in the early mornings, and one letter, written on a cold, clear night in October with the stars enormous overhead, that did not describe the terrain at all, but said simply that she had been thinking about the upper bench and the hawk, and the conversation about what she would do if the land were hers, and that she understood now what her answer had been even then, and that she was looking forward to coming back and saying so properly. His letters arrived at the field camp via the county mail delivery, with a reliability that she found touching. He wrote about the ranch and the cattle and the ongoing work of the fence line correction, and about a long conversation he'd had with Patrick Callahan about the spring and the winter water management, and about a book he was reading, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, which he had found in a box of his mother's things, and which he quoted occasionally with the particular pleasure of someone discovering that a thought they had felt privately for years had already been articulated by someone older and wiser. In the last letter before she returned, he wrote, "I have been thinking about what you said, that if you stayed it would be because you decided to and not because I wanted you to. I want you to know that I think about that every day, and I think it is exactly right, and I also want you to know that the wanting does not diminish simply because I know it is not the appropriate basis for your decision. I am not asking you to take that into account. I am just telling you because it is true, and you have always seemed to prefer truth even when it is inconvenient." She folded that letter and kept it in the inner pocket of her field coat. She came back to Elko in November, when the first real cold was beginning to come off the mountains, and she came back to find that the Surveyor General's office had already sent a second contract offer based on the quality of the Humboldt work, this one for a survey of the Paradise Valley district north of Winnemucca. She came back to find Patrick managing the Callahan land with a new confidence that the restored boundary had given him. She came back to find Mrs. Hatch, who had apparently known everything for months, with a room freshly aired and a supper of chicken pie waiting on the table. She went to the ranch the following morning. Cyrus was at the fence line on the east boundary when she found him, working alongside two of his hands on a section of post replacement, his jacket off despite the cold and his hat pushed back on his head. He saw her coming across the sage flat and straightened up, and said something to his hands that sent them 50 yards along the fence to attend to another section. She dismounted and walked to him, and the space between them closed naturally to something that was not quite touching and not quite not. "Your survey," he said. "How was it?" "Exceptional," she said. "I do good work in the field." "I know," he said. "I read the commissioner's assessment letter. It was forwarded through Aldrich's office." "You read my assessment letter," she said. "Aldrich mentioned it was rather favorable and I may have asked to see it," he said. "I should perhaps have led with congratulations." "You should perhaps have," she agreed. He looked at her steadily. "I'm glad you came back." "I told you I would," she said. "You did," he said. "And you're someone who means what she says." She looked at him for a moment in the cold morning light, the mountains behind him and the sage flat behind her and the corrected fence line running straight between them, and she said, "I've accepted the Paradise Valley contract. It starts in March. It'll be another 3 months in the field." "All right," he said, "but I would like," she said carefully, "to spend the time between now and March here, near here if that is agreeable." "It's more than agreeable," he said quietly. "You know that." "I want to be clear about what I'm saying," she said. "I'm not speaking about simply continuing as we have been. I'm speaking about something with more intention than that." He took a step toward her. "What kind of intention?" She tilted her chin up. "The permanent kind," she said, "if that is what you're also speaking about." The December morning was cold and bright and the sage was gray-green around them, and Cyrus Covington looked at Lavinia Callahan with all of that directness that she had come to understand was simply the way his face expressed what he felt, no decoration and no performance, and said, "It's exactly what I'm speaking about. It's the only thing I've been speaking about for months." "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." "We generally do," he said. He took her face in his hands the way he had in the barn, careful and certain, and kissed her properly this time, for a long moment, in the cold Nevada morning with no one watching except the mountains. And she put her hands against his chest, and felt his heart beating and thought about surveys and springs and forged documents, and the particular long route that two people could travel toward each other when they were both too determined to take the easy path. They were married on the first Saturday of February 1883, in the small Presbyterian church on Railroad Street in Elko, in a ceremony that was attended by Patrick Callahan, who stood up for Lavinia with red eyes he was poorly concealing, and by Pete Grundy, who stood up for Cyrus and looked deeply uncomfortable in a formal coat. Mrs. Clara Hatch was there, and Thomas Aldrich, and a number of ranching families from the surrounding country who had heard enough about the land dispute and its unusual resolution to be curious about its principles. The minister was a practical man named Reverend Cole, who had married enough frontier couples to understand that brevity was a virtue, And the ceremony was spare and sincere, and took less than 20 minutes. What took longer was the supper afterward at the hotel, where Pete Grundy drank enough whiskey to become eloquent in a way that nobody had anticipated, and delivered a toast to the bride and groom that turned out to be largely a commentary on the previous 2 years of watching Cyrus Covington be too stubborn to find the Callahan family sooner, delivered with the affectionate candor of a man who had known his employer since boyhood and felt this entitled him to honesty. Patrick then stood and said that he wanted to say one thing, which was that he had spent 2 years resenting the name Covington, and that he wanted formally and in public to retire that resentment, and that he had visited the spring 3 times that winter and each time found it running clear and cold, and that seemed to him like the whole story. Cyrus stood then and spoke simply and without preparation, which was the only way he had ever said anything that mattered, and said that he was aware that he had done nothing to deserve the trust that Lavinia had extended to him, and that he intended to spend however many years were available to him making it worth her while that she had. And then he sat down and took her hand, and she let him keep it. She went to Paradise Valley for the March survey, as planned, and she came back in June, and she took on 2 more federal survey contracts over the following year, and she worked. She worked seriously and brilliantly, and the reputation she built through the Surveyor General's office became, by 1884, significant enough that her work was cited in the Nevada Territorial Survey report published that year as among the most rigorous of the period. James Phelan wrote to congratulate her from San Francisco, and she wrote back to tell him he had been a good employer, and that the initial 3 weeks of pretending to be Lawrence had been entirely his own fault for assuming. The Callahan and Covington lands operated with a shared understanding of the spring water that had been formalized in the access agreement, and that worked, in practice, better than either formal agreement alone, because Patrick and Cyrus had developed the kind of neighboring relationship that their fathers, by different routes, had failed to achieve. They worked together on the seasonal cattle management and shared equipment during the hay cutting, and Patrick rode over to supper at the Covington ranch often enough that Mrs. Hatch, when she heard about it, said she had always thought Patrick Callahan needed feeding up. In the spring of 1884, Lavinia told Cyrus that she was expecting their first child, and he sat down in the chair at the pine table where she had first laid down the survey report and put his face in his hands for a moment, and when he looked up there was an expression on his face that she had never seen there before, open and bright and entirely unguarded. "Are you all right?" she asked. "More than all right," he said. "I'm just trying to find the words." "You don't need words," she said. He stood up and came to her, and held her with his arms around her and his face in her hair. And outside the ranch house window the spring afternoon was brilliant, and the Tuscaroras were clear against the sky. And she felt, with a completeness she had not expected from any life and certainly not from this one, that every complicated step of the road she had traveled, the cartography firm and the survey archives, and the 3-day train ride, and the landed report and the confirmed truth, had been proceeding with purpose toward this precise point. Their son was born in December of 1884, in the bedroom of the ranch house on a cold, clear night when the stars were out in their winter density, and the mountains were dark masses against the sky. He was healthy and loud about it, and they named him Declan Harlan Covington, which Lavinia had suggested, and which had made Cyrus very still for a long moment before he said that he thought that was right and true. Declan for her father, who had built something worth protecting. Harlan for his, who had done wrong and whose name could be carried by someone who would do differently. Patrick came and met his nephew and sat with him for a long time by the fireside and said very little, the way people sit with small new things that require no commentary. The Paradise Valley Survey report was published in early 1885 and cited Lavinia Callahan Covington, which was how she signed her professional work, as the lead surveyor. The Surveyor General's office wrote to offer her a contract for the Ruby Mountains Interior Survey, which would be the most ambitious survey project in the territory to date, and which she accepted with a clean pleasure and without any conflict, because she had arranged her life, with some care, in a way that held both the work and the family and did not require her to choose between them. Cyrus managed the ranch and she managed the surveys. And when she was in the field, Cyrus managed both with the help of Pete Grundy and without complaint. And when she came home from the field, the ranch house met her with warmth and the smell of good food, and a husband who asked how the survey had gone with genuine interest, and listened to the answer. Little Declan, who they called Dec, learned to walk in the spring of 1886 and immediately applied himself to exploring the ranch with a thoroughness that suggested he had inherited both his mother's cartographic instincts and his father's determination. He was a sturdy, cheerful child with Lavinia's green eyes and Cyrus's deliberate quality of attention, and he approached the world with a scientific seriousness that made Pete Grundy declare him the finest future rancher in Lander County, which Lavinia accepted gracefully while privately thinking he might also make a fine surveyor. In the autumn of 1886, Lavinia completed the Ruby Mountain survey, which was delivered to the Surveyor General's office in Carson City in October, and which the state geologist, reviewing it the following spring, described as one of the most complete interior surveys of the Great Basin region ever produced, a document that would serve Nevada territory for decades. She came home from Carson City on a cold October afternoon to find Cyrus on the front porch of the ranch house with Dec on his knee reading, aloud from the same battered copy of Marcus Aurelius he had found in his mother's things, the boy solemn and attentive in the particular way of children who understand they are being given something serious. She stood at the edge of the porch and watched them for a moment without being noticed. This, she thought, this is the whole map of it, every boundary correctly drawn. She stepped up onto the porch and Dec lunged for her immediately, making the specific noise he made when she came home from the field, which was the happiest sound she had ever heard, and she caught him and held him and looked at Cyrus over the top of the boy's head. "How was Carson City?" he asked. "The Surveyor General called the Ruby Mountains report the finest of the decade," she said. "He'd be right," Cyrus said, without a shadow of anything other than conviction. She sat down beside him with Dec in her lap and the book between them, and the evening was coming down from the mountains in long blue shadows, and the spring was running in its channel out beyond the cottonwoods, and the corrected fence line was exactly where it should be, and the land was exactly as it had always been, clear and cold and honest beneath the Nevada sky. She told him in November that there would be a second child in the summer, and his face did the same thing it had done the first time, the open, unguarded brightness that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with the man he had become in the years since he had sat on the floor of his father's study with 8 letters in his hands and had to decide what kind of person he was going to be. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. "Dec will have opinions about this," he said. "Dec has opinions about everything," she said. "He comes by it honestly." Their daughter arrived in June of 1887, on a warm afternoon when the cottonwoods by the spring channel were full of their summer leaves, and they named her Clara, for Mrs. Hatch, who had been the first kind face in Elko, and who was still running her boarding house and still cooking chicken pie, and who received the news of her namesake with a brisk, pleased nod that was the most emotional Lavinia had ever seen her. Dec received his sister with the grave, assessing curiosity of a 2.5-year-old who has been told this is important and is trying to determine in what way, and then patted her head once with enormous care, and said something that neither Lavinia nor Cyrus could quite interpret, but that seemed to indicate acceptance, and returned to his inspection of a beetle he had been tracking near the porch steps. The Covington Ranch in the summer of 1887 was a different thing than it had been 5 years earlier, not larger in the material sense, not dramatically transformed, but different in the way a thing is different when it has been brought into right relationship with the land and the people around it. The corrected boundary and the water access agreement had normalized the relationship with the Callahan land in a way that benefited both properties quietly and continuously. Patrick had brought on a partner, a man from Utah named Samuel Crawford, who was reliable and steady, and between them they had the Callahan operation running with a surplus for the first time since Declan's death. The spring fed both properties as geography had always intended. One evening in late August, when Dec was in bed and Clara was sleeping in her cradle and the night air was warm and full of the smell of sage, Lavinia and Cyrus sat on the front porch in the dark as they often did, the way people who are comfortable with each other sit, without needing to fill the space. "I've been thinking about the upper bench," Lavinia said. He looked at her. "I want to do a proper survey of it," she said. "Not for the government, for us. A complete topographic map of this whole section of the basin, both properties. The kind that shows everything, the springs, the seasonal watercourses, the rock formations that don't have names yet, the bench, all of it." "That would take months," he said. "It would," she said. "I could do it between contracts." "What would you do with it when it was finished?" She thought about this. "Keep it," she said. "Have it here in the house for Dec and Clara, so they know what they're standing on, so they grow up understanding the actual shape of the land they're going to inherit." He was quiet for a moment. "Then your father would have wanted that." "Yes," she said, "he would have." She began the private survey of the basin section in September, working on it in the hours between her other work and the children's needs, taking Dec with her when he was old enough to hold the rod and stand still, which he was excellent at, and working the sections near the spring and the upper bench in the long, clear October afternoons with the light that turned everything to copper and gold. She mapped the spring and its channel. She mapped the bench and the long view east. She mapped the corrected fence line and the old one and the 412 yards between them, which she marked on the survey document in a notation that read simply, "Boundary restored, 1882. Cyrus came with her on the last day of the survey work, a cold November morning when the ground was hard and the mountains had their first light snow on the upper ridges, and they stood together on the upper bench with the completed survey notes in her hands and looked out at the valley below, the same view they had sat with 3 years earlier over a shared meal when she had still been in the process of deciding what she was deciding. "I remember the first time you saw this," he said. "I asked you what you would do with the land if it were yours outright," she said. "And you said you would map it," he said. She looked down at the survey notes in her hands and then out at the valley. "I told you then that the county maps were full of errors," she said, "that this basin deserved to be properly understood." "You did," he said. "I didn't know then that I was describing something that was also a conversation about myself," she said. He looked at her. "What do you mean?" She considered how to say it precisely, which was always how she did things. "I mean that the work I was describing, mapping something truly, correcting the errors, understanding the actual shape of the terrain rather than the assumed shape of it, that's what you did. With me. From the beginning. You looked at what was actually there instead of what you expected to find. You didn't try to make me fit the shape you needed." He was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the valley. "You make me sound better than I am," he said. "I map things accurately," she said. "I don't flatter terrain." Something moved in his expression, and he turned to her and took her hand where it held the survey notes and held both, the papers and the hand, with that careful certainty that was still, years in, the way he did everything. "Lavinia," he said. "Yes," she said. "I love you," he said. "Very simply, that's all." She looked at him, the weathered face and the dark eyes and the mountains behind him, and she felt the truth of the ground they were standing on, the spring below and the corrected boundary and the honest record of it all in her hands, and she said, "I love you," also very simply. The survey document was completed in December of 1887 and rolled into a protective case and hung in the ranch house on the wall opposite the window, where the morning light fell across it and made its lines readable from across the room. Dec, who was 3 by then and had an opinion about everything, pointed at the spring and said its name, which was not a name on any official map and which he had given it himself, and which Lavinia added to the document in small, careful letters in the lower left corner under his name. It was a good map. It was an accurate one. It showed everything that was there, the springs and the benchlands and the corrected lines, the terrain as it actually was, without apology and without omission. Which was, as it turned out, the best possible description of the life they had made. The years settled into shape around them with the quality of a well-built thing, not dramatic in its ongoing arrangements but deeply, sustainably good. The ranch prospered. The surveys continued. Deck grew into a serious, curious boy who could read a topographic map at 5 and ride a horse credibly at 6, and who had his mother's green eyes and his father's steady way of looking at a problem until it explained itself. Clara was forthright and physical, more interested in the cattle operations than in cartography from an early age, and rode with her father before she could walk without assistance, which Pete Grundy found entirely sensible and declared her the finest horsewoman of the next generation. In 1889, Nevada achieved full statehood, which Lavinia had been anticipating professionally since 1885. The statehood surveys generated a significant new body of contract work for qualified surveyors, and Lavinia took on 3 state contracts over the following 2 years that resulted in official state survey documents that bore her name and were filed in the state archives in Carson City. She was one of 3 women working in professional survey capacity in the new state of Nevada, and the fact of this was something she held with a quiet, unshowy pride. Not because she needed to be singular, but because she had stood in a room in San Francisco and signed her name with only an initial, and she knew what it had cost, all of it, and it was good to see the cost beginning to return. On a Sunday morning in the spring of 1890, she and Cyrus rode to the upper bench alone, as they did sometimes when the children were with Pete Grundy or with Patrick, and they sat on the flat rock with the long view before them, and she showed him the latest state survey contract offer for the Northern Basin and Ranges, which would be the largest single survey project she had undertaken. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I want it," she said, "and that I'll be away for 4 months." "Then take it," he said. "We'll manage." She looked at him sideways. "You never say, 'Are you sure?' or 'What about the children?' or 'Isn't that rather a long time?'" "Those things are true," he said. "And you've already weighed them, or you wouldn't be sitting here showing me the letter. You're not asking me whether to take it, you're telling me you're going to." She laughed, a short, genuine sound that startled a bird from the sage below them. "I've trained you terribly," she said. "You've been consistent," he said. "I pay attention." She leaned against his shoulder, and the morning was warm, and the hawk, or a hawk, the high desert seemed to have an ongoing supply of them, was riding the thermals out over the basin floor, and she thought about everything the view contained, all the springs and the boundaries and the forgeries and the long road from San Francisco and the survey report on a pine table and 3 words, "I already know." She had arrived with a surveyor's report and a look that said she already knew the answer. He had confirmed it. She had not known then that the answer she had come for was only the beginning of the larger question, the question of what the land between them could look like when it was honestly mapped, all of it, the difficult terrain and the beautiful terrain and the corrected lines and the springs that ran clear under all of it. She knew now. The basin stretched before them, accurately charted and deeply familiar, and the morning was theirs, and it was, by every honest measure, exactly as good as the best possible survey of it would show. She took his hand and held it, and neither of them spoke, and the hawk circled once more and lifted on a thermal and was gone over the ridge, and the spring ran in its channel below, cold and clear and constant, as it had always done and would continue to do long after all the fences and all the documents and all the necessary corrections were finally and completely and permanently settled. Which, at last, they were.